Hello and welcome. I'm Imran Gupta, sitting in for Riz Khan. As European governments slash spending to tackle a crippling financial crisis, is this the beginning of the end for the welfare state of Europe? Well, thousands of people are demonstrating against cuts to social programs, wages and pensions in Greece and other European nations. Last week, students poured into the streets of London to protest the British Parliament's decision to triple university fees. Major demonstrations have also rocked Spain, Italy and Portugal, nations hit particularly hard by the debt crisis. That happened after European banks lost billions of dollars they had invested in the US subprime mortgage market, which collapsed back in 2008. Well, today we ask, as Europe continues to reel from a prolonged financial crisis, what is the future of its welfare model? Remember, you can call in with your questions and comments. We also welcome your comments and your questions on the show. Well, joining us now is economist Will Hutton, appointed by Britain's Conservative government to head an inquiry into public sector pay. He's also the author of the book Them and Us, Changing Britain, Why We Need a Fair Society. Also joining us is Gavin Poole, director of the Centre for Social Justice, a conservative British think tank. They're both in London. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Mr. Poole, if I could start with you, this idea that either you can choose a AAA credit rating and financial collapse, or you have to have the welfare state. It's a false choice, isn't it?
I think that is a false choice. I mean, I think the issue around the welfare state is that most modern governments would accept that you need to support the population which you serve. I think the issue, though, is around the level of support that welfare state is going to provide to protect the individuals, and actually the level of support that the individual needs to provide to the country is offering that financial assistance. And the whole welfare model should be based around getting people back into work and not leaving them excluded from mainstream society. So
you support the concept, but the implementation is problematic for you, is it?
I'm not too sure that the implementation, I think the key issue that we keep on running into, particularly in this country, is making the case that welfare reform is inexplicably linked with austerity measures and the cuts which we're seeing in this country. I think the issue which this government has decided to take on is they need to make the cuts, they need to drive down the deficit this country is finding itself in, but to do this without actually reforming something as huge as the welfare state, which frankly had got out of control over the previous decade or so, would be wrong. And actually making sure you could reform the welfare state at the same time as you're driving down the deficit means that the structural deficit will be reduced over a longer period of time.
Will Hutton, to make cuts without reforming the welfare state is wrong, according to Gavin Poole. What do you think?
Well, there's an area of agreement between me and Gavin Poole and a substantial area of disagreement. And I think that, essentially, I think that it is whole societies that innovate, take risks. It's from whole societies that you draw your stock of entrepreneurs and of sports people or whatever. And if you neglect the bottom 10, 20, 30% and allow them to have no opportunity, you're in severe trouble. There has to be a social bargain. That is a profound statement, and it's one which I think every European state, to a lesser or greater degree, there's a majority of the population that buys that to a much greater extent than in the United States, and indeed, actually, some Arab countries. This is a very much a European conception. Now, how do you do it? And how do you do it in a way that actually doesn't trap people into dependence? And that is the kind of $64,000 question. Now, that question for me is independent of where the budget deficit is at this moment in the economic cycle. As a matter of fact, I don't take the view that actually cutting the budget deficit at the speed at which this coalition government wants to cut it at is economically right. And I think that some of the decisions they've taken over what to cut have provoked a profound social reaction. And a profound social reaction because most people in Western democracies, and heaven knows the situation is much worse in less developed countries, are really only moderate, very moderate incomes. 90% of people in Britain earn less than $60,000 a year, and the average salary the average income in Britain is around $35,000. And these are not large sums of money to manage life's risks, and the social settlement is there to buttress that. And you have to start with that and then make adjustments from that. And to protect it at moments of weakness like this is more important, not less important.
Gavin, Poole, we've seen these university fee protests in London and elsewhere. There have been massive protests. People are obviously not happy with these cuts.
Well, if you look at what's going on with the protests about the rise in university fees, I mean, your leader said it's been tripled to £9,000. It's actually the minimum payment's been doubled to £6,000, and actually universities can go up to £9,000 should they wish to do so. I think the way that it's been reported, having mass demonstrations such as this is something that doesn't really happen too often in the UK, so quite rightly it gets high media attention. But if you look at the scale of what is being seen in Parliament Square, and if you remember, this is reasonably isolated into a very small section of London by a very small number of students who are campaigning, and actually the images that you're showing on TV is from an even smaller minority of people who have come on the demonstration just to stir up trouble.
The images don't seem to look like a small minority of people, but I'm not going to dispute, you know, the figures and to the extent that it's representative of society. However, somewhere down the road, you're going to have a more stratified society, aren't you? Because you're going to have wealth perpetuating wealth. University education is only going to be for the upper middle classes. That can't be a good long-term strategy for Britain's economy, can it?
No, I think if you look at, rather than just the strap line of, well, the media is reporting it's £9,000 to go to university. If you look at what the universities are being asked to do is to make provision for those children who are coming from poorer backgrounds are able to go to university. There's an increase in bursaries, an increase in grants. Actually, that stratification of society which you're alluding to will not be there. There's a lot of examples already in the education system where bursaries are being used with great effect, and this should be put out to the universities. But the fundamental issue here is this, which is if you wish, and there's a discussion there between myself and Will about the speed at which deficit reduction is being paid back or being affected. If you are going to reduce the burden of debt on society, actually this is going to be paid by reducing the costs somewhere.
And actually I'm sorry to harp on the education thing and interrupt you again, but there's a government study from the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills released on Sunday that said that under the new laws and the new hike in fees, only a quarter of graduates will be able to pay off their loans in their lifetimes. That's a fairly shocking statistic, is it not?
I think you've also got to look at when does the repayment mechanisms actually kick in? When are the bursaries actually being paid? I mean, you're looking at everybody will have to pay those off. Everybody will have to fund to 9,000, which simply isn't the case. And the issue here is, drastic measures are being taken by this coalition to drive down the deficit, and you can't pick on isolated issues such as the increase in university tuition fees. You can't look at just the way that the welfare system's been reformed. You've got to look at the entire package of what this coalition is trying to do. There has been no provision made in this country for a recession such as we're seeing. And actually what the country needs to do is get through this recession, have sustained growth, and at the moment all the indicators are steady, but small, but steady growth. And I think this is something that we need to look at. And then later on, there will be reinvestment. But just to keep on going, spending the money and getting further and further into debt would be a grave mistake, I think, for any government to take at this point in time.
Will Hatton?
I mean, I think first of all, I support the principle of tuition fees, but I don't support doubling them from one year to another. And actually, in many universities, they're going to be more than doubled because the grants to support fees from government have been eliminated in arts and social sciences. And I actually think that you look at just the income distribution in Britain, we're asking a great many people from homes where the incomes are 25, 30, 35, 40,000 a year, to assume debts of what will be more than £50,000 because the government won't assume the debt. So it's passing the debt from itself to people who have not got great means. Now, if the UK was very heavily indebted, that would be just about justifiable. But as a matter of fact, the national debt has been higher than the current level for the last 250 years. It just isn't true that there is a kind of debt crisis, and to displace the debt from the public sphere to the private sphere and declare that's a solution is an abdication of the view that there is a social settlement. And this is I come back to my first answer. You have to think in terms of actually what the social deal is, and everyone is a member of that social deal. In Ireland, the government today is passing legislation to require the Allied Irish Bank not to pay bonuses because of the outcry that paying 2,000 bankers large bonuses at a time when public sector employees are taking wage cuts, in the private sector unemployment is rising astonishingly, was just seen as a declaration of independence by bankers from actually Irish society.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make.
Irish society has fought back, and we are actually banks, businesses trade in society. They have a license to trade in society. People who work for them are part of that society.
Okay, and let's pose that to Gavin Poole. Sorry to interrupt you. Let's pose that to Gavin Poole. The point being made that when you talk about dependency and a culture of dependency, the way a lot of people on the ground see it is that it's a dependency that the banks have on the state bailing them out. And it's effectively a welfare state for the banks because they get an entire nation into trouble and they can rely on being bailed out by the governments. That's at the crux of the grievance of so many people.
I mean, there's no doubt that the British public are quite annoyed about the way that the banking system has let them down, and they actually feel that they're wholly responsible for a lot of what's gone on around the world. I go back to an earlier point about was the country prepared to absorb this type of shock? I don't believe that we were. But what Will brings out is the whole issue there around dependence. You bring out, around the whole issue around dependency is something which is worth exploring further. Which is if you end up with people who are solely dependent on receiving handouts from the state, then the state needs to be able to gear up and continue to meet those payments. And that's not acceptable. And actually, if you listen to the people on the street, if you look at the way the media are now reporting this, it shows that the people who are working, who are paying their taxes, who are working hard, in quite difficult circumstances, are actually quite annoyed on two issues. One is, the banks. So you've already mentioned the banks. The second thing is, why are they funding a welfare state which is paying on average someone an equivalent of over £30,000 if you take in all of the passported benefits as well, when these people themselves are working, often on very low incomes, paying taxes, and these people are now getting quite mobilised, saying, we're fed up of this. And the way that the welfare reforms here are being portrayed in the media has shifted, and I believe it's shifted quite rightly, from saying this is not about cutting support to individuals, it's actually making sure that individuals who are in receipt of benefits are being assisted into work. And then that leads you into another question about work creation, job creation.
Okay, Will Hutton, quick response before we take a break. Will?
Well, it's like a Venn diagram. There's an overlap between my opinions and those of Gavin, and substantive areas of difference. And I mean, a director of the Centre for Social Justice should know, and it's a small disgrace, not a great disgrace, but there's a small disgrace on an international television channel like this to give the impression that there are a large number of people in Britain receiving benefits of £30,000. I mean, that is received by a tiny minority. And one of the difficulties with funding so much of our welfare payments out of the tax base and not out of social insurance is that actually, inevitably at least, a taxpayer is saying, well, how are my tax pounds, or how are my tax euros, or how are my tax dollars being spent? And if they're not, and you get very quickly into this question of the deserving and the undeserving poor. I'm for this idea of a social settlement in which everybody pays a social insurance premium into a common pool, And then when they need it, when life's hazards hit them, unemployment, for example, or disability, they're not getting a handout, they're getting something that they deserve because they paid into the common pool an insurance premium, and they're getting out the insurance payment when things go wrong for them.
Okay.
And that is the way to think about this. And I think that actually as this recession carries on, and as people start to witness their friends and their relatives getting into trouble, big trouble, the conversation will move away from this handout discourse into we need a system of social insurance to navigate life's risks.
You got the point across. We're going to broaden this out after the break, but we have to take a short break now. More of our discussion in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. From Britain to Bulgaria, a wave of protests and strikes have swept through Europe as governments tighten budgets and slash services to deal with the ongoing financial crisis. Let's look at some of the biggest demonstrations. Greek unions have launched a week of protests against labour reforms and other austerity measures. Last week, angry students poured into the streets of London after Parliament's decision to triple university tuition fees, as we mentioned. Also last week, public sector employees went on strike in the Czech Republic against government plans to cut wages by 10%. On November 27, thousands held demonstrations in Dublin to protest against a bailout plan. Well, what does this mean for Europe's welfare model? I'm discussing the issues with economist Will Hutton, one of Britain's leading commentators on European politics, and Gavin Poole, Executive Director of the conservative British think tank, the Centre for Social Justice. Gavin Poole, as we broaden this out, are Ireland and Greece on the right path in dealing with the crisis?
I think with the significant bailout plans which they're receiving, and it's up to now the governments to put in place the measures that opportunity is not squandered. And okay, of course, they have all the checks and balances now which the bailout plans will have in place. I think they've got some difficult times ahead. They've got some difficult decisions. We're talking previously about what we've done in here in the UK and what the coalition government are doing, and the criticism that's being levelled at them and the decisions they're having to make. I think what's going to happen in Greece and what we're starting to see now in Ireland means that we're at the start of something which is going to be very, very difficult indeed to support those economies so that further bailout plans aren't required.
Again, something that we hear quite often from Greeks angry at these austerity measures is that they didn't get themselves into the quagmire. It was the politicians, the bankers, the speculators that did. An organization like Goldman Sachs helped the Greek government hide some of its debts, yet Goldman Sachs isn't facing austerity measures. The Greek people are. Is that a strong argument?
It's an argument that can be made in any democracy, which is if you elect a government to serve, then actually you've got the democratic process to vote them out and put someone else in their place. Now, we can't comment on what's been said, what happened to Goldman's, whether it's true, whether it's not true. I think the issue there is a population has a democracy. It works within a democracy, it elects people within a democracy, and needs to make sure that there's enough checks and balances in place so they govern effectively, they govern wisely, and they understand the implications of some of the decisions that they are making. I mean, something that we've been quite keen to point out in all of our work at the Centre for Social Justice on welfare reform is there's actually a law of unforeseen consequence. And actually sometimes, because of the way that these dynamic effects that some of these changes will have, they're not really fully understood at the point of application. And we believe there needs to be greater work in really thinking through some of these issues so that you don't end up in a repeat situation.
Let's dip into one of our many emails that have come through. This one from Fatima Shah in Pakistan. She says Europe needs to prioritize. There are billions of euros worth of aid provided to developing countries, while it is still controversial how useful donor-driven development programs are. It's the right of the people who pay taxes to decide where it's best to spend them. Well, Hutton, what do you think about what Fatima Shah had to say there?
I think it's a very interesting point to come from Pakistan. I mean, these aid budgets in Western Europe are you know, on average about half of 1% of GDP, and even if they were eliminated altogether, they wouldn't do the business in terms of closing these big budget deficits, and yet the impact of that on many of the recipient countries would be, I would submit, greater than your Pakistani emailer suggests. I mean, you know, it's going to be. I also don't. I think that, you know, we have to think smarter about the way in which money flows to the less developed world. That's absolutely clear. But whether it's hard infrastructure and sometimes soft infrastructure, you do need dollars and euros, and to actually cut off the flow, I think, would be wrong. But I want to come back to this question of Europe. I mean, if the Irish and the Greeks cannot get these programs through, if in particular one or two or three of these countries in a kind of domino effect are forced out of the euro because of the scale of popular revolt against these breaking of the social settlement in these countries, it's going to be a disaster for Europe and a disaster, I think, for the world.
Yeah, economists talk of this contagion. I mean, do you really see that happening? I remember Ben Bernanke in 2007 saying the subprime mortgage crisis in the US will not affect the world, and it did. Do you see Europe's crisis actually affecting the world? Is it that dramatic?
Well, the structure of banking at the moment is such that, you know, Bank A lends money to, it could be subprime mortgages in the States, or it could be, you know, real estate speculation in Spain, and then that loan package is sold on to Bank B, sold on to Bank C, sold on to Bank D, and you're never quite sure where in the system who's holding these assets that prove to be, you know, broken down or you know, worth much less than anyone thought.
Will Hutton, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt you because we have run out of time. These are ominous signs indeed, but I'm really sorry. Will Hutton, Will Hutton and Gavin Poole, it's been a pleasure hearing your thoughts. Thanks for joining us here. Thanks for being with us. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the show and post your questions and your comments. On the next Riz Khan show, Africa United, a road movie that reflects the spirit as well as the contradictions of the continent. We'll be talking to director Debs Gardner-Patterson and actor Emmanuel Jal. Make sure to tune in for that. See you next time.